Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the biblical Jesus, the historical Jesus, and the modern American pop culture Jesus. And our overall connecting theme will be Jesus! The story of Jesus comes up in the lectionary on every day except Pentecost, but also kind of even then. So we are not linking to all of the times that Jesus comes up. But the specific passages that we are talking about in this episode, which are more than our usual episodes this season, do come up for the most part. So our John 1 reading comes up as the gospel reading for both Christmas Day and the second Sunday of Christmas every year. Our Luke 4 reading is split between the third and fourth Sundays after Epiphany in Year C. Our Mark 15 reading is an option for the Passion reading for those who do Passion Sunday in Lent or Palm Passion Sunday for Year B. Our Matthew 28 reading is an option for the Gospel for Easter Sunday in Year A. And our Matthew 5 reading is the Gospel for both the fourth Sunday after Epiphany and All Saints' Day in Year A. And we will link to our episodes on those days so that you can check them out if you would like. We do have 2 content notifications for you for this episode. The first is that we talk about white Jesus's impact, particularly regarding white supremacy and white nationalism during the pop culture Jesus conversation, and we mention antisemitism throughout the episode.
Yeah. Also, we'd love for you to join us by becoming a Patreon supporter for more content at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch, and you can check out the episode description for links to any references that we make in this episode, and there's going to be a few.
Quite a few. Also, we really want to increase our Patreon support so we can do more cool things like our movie commentaries and uncut episodes and other stuff and more. So if you're not a Patreon supporter, now's the time to consider it. So we're starting our episode with Jesus, obviously. But we're going to talk about the biblical Jesus, which is, Kay's and my bread and butter. It's literally our jobs.
Our daily bread, you might say.
Huh, weird. So, biblical Jesus, we trace biblical Jesus's life to being born around 0 CE in Bethlehem, which is the town. Bethlehem means house of bread. And when we are kind of combining all of the gospel accounts together, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, grew up as a refugee in Egypt, returned to Nazareth as a young child to grow up. And aside from a preteen temple visit, we don't actually know much about Jesus until his ministry started around the age of 30, though I'm not actually sure how we get the age of 30 as the starting date. But
I know.
Somehow we did.
There was a tax that Jewish men 30 years old and older had to pay, and when Jesus is talking about give unto Caesar, he mentions that he and I think Simon Peter pay it.
Okay. Okay, so that's how he started he started his ministry around the age of 30, and debatably he had about 3 years of active ministry, or 3 Passovers at least. Mm-hmm. And then he was executed by the state, that is the Roman Empire, in a crucifixion, which was a very political execution. And with non-hourly calculations, Jesus rose on the 3rd day, chilled with the followers, ascended to heaven, see our collected podcasts, and rumor has it Jesus is coming back again. That is a very, very, very basic kind of overview of Jesus' life according to the Gospels, and it is a compilation, right? It's a mishmash. The reality is the story we think of as the nativity story only appears in Luke. Jesus' genealogy appears in Matthew, and a slightly different one appears in Luke. Jesus starts basically as a grown-up in Mark, And Matthew also has the account with the Magi and the flight to Egypt. And then John has this beautiful poetic introduction to the Gospel of John. And in it, Jesus is named as the Word, or Logos in Greek, of God, which connects him to woman wisdom, Sophia, in the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly in the book of Proverbs. Well, that was Athena.
Hi, Athena.
Our little bitty puppy, who is not so little bitty anymore. She is almost 4 months old. We're still working on crate training and getting used to being calm and quiet and all of those things. She's,
She's adorable.
She is adorable. She has doubled in weight since we got her. She just went to the vet and she's 29.4 pounds. When we got her, she was like 15 pounds. So, the Gospels in the Bible, there are 4 Gospels, and they each tell a different story of Jesus. And 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are the synoptic Gospels, and their storylines tend to line up fairly well. John is the outlier. It's very poetic. The Jesus that we encounter in John is very much a divine Jesus who is in control of everything. And the author of John, from what we can tell, is writing to a Jewish community and pushing them to get to the point of actually figuring out what they believe and taking a side. So John sets up a lot of dichotomies for Jesus to get people to take a side and to own their faith in Jesus. It was also the last one written. And then on the flip side of that is Mark, which was the first one written, likely written right after, but certainly around the time of the destruction of the temple. And Mark is very clearly written from an oral storytelling perspective, which they all come from an oral tradition before they were written down. But Mark is all about the action. You go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. Jesus is very much human. You really get the humanity of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. He gets frustrated with disciples. He calls a woman a dog. And he is still, the one who is the leader of this movement.
Yeah.
Mark introduces Jesus as this is the good news, which is something that is usually told about Caesar or about someone divine. And so that's how Mark introduces the gospel. And then Luke and Matthew were between those two and had different audiences and different focuses. Luke and Matthew both have a lot of what Mark has, but taken with their own embellishments and twists. And they also have a lot of shared stories from somewhere else. It could be that one used the other, or there's a conversation about the Q source, which is a source that Mark didn't have access to, but both Luke and Matthew did. We don't really know. We know that Luke and the book of Acts are likely written by the same person, so they're kind of a two-parter. And the Gospel of Luke has a lot of focus on justice, on liberation, and has a lot of parody in stories. So if there's a story about a man, there's probably a story about a woman that's connected to it, or those sorts of things. It has Mary's Magnificat. It has these beautiful stories, these beautiful and powerful parables, and all sorts of that stuff in it. And then Matthew, in many ways, is focusing on Jewish community. So Matthew uses a lot of scriptural references. Not all of them are particularly the most accurate. There are a couple that it seems like Matthew is using the Latin translation of the scriptures to justify stuff, but also depicts Jesus with parallels to Moses, for example, with a flight out of Egypt, with some of the discourses, some of the big sermons that he preaches. Yeah. So when we think about the problematic parts of this, Matthew and John have the most easily anti-Semitic content, and Mark and Luke have less of that. No matter what, if you're reading scripture and you're reading about Jesus, you should definitely be aware that there is a lot of anti-Semitism that has been built into it, whether or not it was there in the first place, because most of these authors in scriptures were Jewish, but they were Jewish people oftentimes talking to their own community. And that's a different way of talking about Jewish people than non-Jewish people talking about Jewish people. And so it has been interpreted a lot more anti-Semitic than it necessarily was in the moment, in the time that the stories were told and that they were written down.
Yeah.
There are also a lot of non-canonical Gospels. So there's the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, a lot of those that give different stories about Jesus, different things Jesus said, different ways of understanding Jesus. They are not in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that they're not important reads or valuable in understanding our faith. The ones that are in the gospel got in the gospel for particular reasons. And one of the things that I think is the most compelling thing about having the Gospels is that there are 4 of them and they tell different stories and have different depictions of Jesus. And I love that integral in the Christian Bible is diversity. It is diversity of experience. It is diversity of perspectives. And so having 4 Gospels does that. Could we have more? Potentially. Could we have fewer? It'd be tough. But I really love that aspect of how we understand Jesus in that respect. Yeah. What's your favorite Gospel?
My favorite Gospel is Luke, because he's a wonderful storyteller, and he really fleshes out the people. How about you, Emily?
Luke is wonderful. I really love Mark, and Mark goes really well with John. Not everybody feels that way, but I really like them paired together because Mark has such a human Jesus, and John has such a divine Jesus.
They're a good contrast.
And then I also really like Luke.
Sure.
And Matthew is my 4th favorite.
Yes, I guess John is my 4th favorite, mostly because I think that if you can't explain what you're saying to an 8-year-old, then you don't really know what you're talking about, and no 8-year-old understands John. So...
It's true. There's a lot of philosophizing that John...
And I was a philosophy major, and yet still, yeah.
Yeah. So what is Jesus known for? Well, a lot of things. Certainly, Jesus is one person of the Trinity, which is the deity in Christianity. Trinity is triune God, so both 3 and 1 at the same time, because, like we said, we can't math. We can't math the 3 days. We can't math 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. That's what you get from Christians, basically. And Jesus also is one who defies boundaries and binaries, right? He defies the boundary and the binary of divine or human, dead or alive. He crosses boundaries. There are some parts of the gospel where he's just constantly crossing the sea, and that is intended to be a crossing from Jewish territory to Gentile territory and back again, and this shifting of perspectives. And he's known for healing, he's known for feeding multitudes, he's known for preaching and teaching, for being executed by the state, for conquering death, and depending on the gospel, for working outside of the empire or working against the empire. He's known for creating a chosen family. A lot of times we call them the disciples or the apostles or Jesus followers. There are 12 that are kind of named depending on the gospel. You get some different names for a lot of them. But also we know that he had followers of many genders and friends of many genders. So those are some of the things that Jesus is known for. And then I picked out 3 passages in addition to the John one that I mentioned earlier that I think really help give an understanding of who the biblical Jesus is. So the first one is Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 23. Jesus announces his ministry in his hometown with a well-known passage from Isaiah, leading to the community's shock, about which Jesus challenges them. So Jesus goes to the synagogue, opens the scroll, finds Isaiah, finds the particular place in Isaiah, and then reads, "The Spirit of the becoming God is upon me, because God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of God's favor." And then rolls it up and sits down and then says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And it is like his starter sermon mission statement in Luke in a lot of ways.
Mic drop.
And people are amazed. Yes, mic drop. And people are amazed and then are like, "Isn't this Joseph's kid?" And Jesus does not react well to that. He's like, Y'all are gonna just get mad and be like, Doctor, cure yourself. Do here what you've done in other places. And then they get mad and they do reject Jesus later on. So it's just kind of this perfect little microcosm of Jesus naming what he's about very clearly, and the reality that there's some tension between Jesus and other people.
Yeah.
And then Mark 15:16 through 41 is the bulk of the story of the crucifixion. So it goes from Roman soldiers mocking Jesus to forcing him to make the trek with his cross and some help to Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, and is right outside of the city, to be crucified with other criminals of the Roman Empire. And that is where he dies. And I picked Mark because Mark is the more concise gospel, but also because this is such a key point in all of the gospels. Even in Mark, which is such a short gospel, it's basically an entire chapter. And it's just a lot.
Yeah.
And it very clearly depicts this as a state execution. There is religious stuff that gets mixed into it, but crucifixion is a punishment of the state, of the Roman Empire, and is how Jesus died. And then Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10, Jesus is resurrected, and the women, in this case Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, are the first to encounter Jesus and share the gospel with the rest of the disciples. In every single of the 4 gospels, women are the first ones at the tomb for the resurrection.
But we don't talk about the long ending of Mark.
Yeah, Mark has basically like fan fiction endings. People were unsettled by the initial shorter ending, and so they just kept tacking them on. But even in Mark, women are the first ones at the tomb, the first ones to know about the resurrection. Mm-hmm. And so in Matthew, they encounter the empty tomb. There's a great earthquake. The angel says, "Don't be afraid. You're looking for Jesus. Look, he's not here. Go tell his disciples." While they're on the way to tell the disciples, Jesus appears to them and then reaffirms, "Go tell them to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." So each gospel has a different way of talking about it, but in all of the gospels, Mary Magdalene and some number of other women show up at the tomb in the early morning. And I love that. I love that women are the first ones at the tomb, and it makes sense. And anybody that tries to tell you that sunrise services are bad is wrong, because that's when the women showed up.
On the other hand, if you're just not caffeinated enough for a sunrise sermon, that's a different situation. Like, they might be bad for you personally.
Yeah, but they're not bad. And there's not, like, my favorite actually has been the Easter Vigil starting at, like, 6 a.m. Because then you get the great stories of the faith, but we're not pretending like the disciples actually stayed up overnight. Because they didn't. They were in grief, but they did not stay up. We have no proof of that. No evidence. Yeah. Anyway. So, that's biblical Jesus. A very short and condensed accounting of biblical Jesus. So what do you love about them? Okay?
About biblical Jesus, as opposed to the other Jesuses
Yeah.
we're going to talk about today? Well,
Yes.
I have to say that one of the things that I love about Jesus is how he extends grace to everyone, including a lot of people that other people don't want him to extend grace to. He is welcoming and open to and loving toward people that society would tell him not to be. And he actually gets flack for it. And he deals with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How about you, Emily?
Yeah. For me, also, there is, because the Gospels are so diverse, we get all of these different facets of Jesus. We get a Jesus who deeply cares about people and about the things that they are going through. There are very few stories that are in all 4 Gospels. The crucifixion is one. Another one is the feeding of the multitude. Mark even has 2 of those. A feeding of the 4,000 and a feeding of the 5,000. Plus all of the non-men.
Yeah.
And I love that Jesus is showing up not just healing people who are in need of healing communities, helping people reincorporate into communities, casting out demons, preaching and naming truths, but also is just like, oh, look, there's a bunch of people who are hungry. Yeah, we're going to feed them. We're not just going to send them away.
Pulling an endless series of fish sandwiches out of his pockets.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I really love that part.
Yeah.
And our tie-in to today's theme, which is Jesus, is that this is Jesus. The primary account of Jesus' life that we have is biblical. We have some other historical stuff, but the majority of the information comes from Scripture.
Yeah.
And because of that, and because we who listen to this podcast at least know English, but most of us probably aren't fluent in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek.
My Hebrew professors still despair of me, and they haven't had to see me in years.
Because of this, it's important when we read Scripture, when we read the Gospels or Acts or the epistles, whatever we are reading, we take it with a grain of salt. We know that this is a translation, and every translation comes with some sort of interpretation. Translators make choices to convey meaning as best they can. And some biblical translations try to do it so it sounds the best. Some try to be the most particular and faithful to their understanding of the original word. Some try to get the sense of it. There are all sorts of different emphases that people have when they translate Scripture. So part of what I like to do is read multiple different translations. One of the most accurate in terms of trying to match word for word definitions is the updated version of the New Revised Standard Version. But I also have a First Nations version of the New Testament, and that's really cool. Someone in a past congregation gave me the Gospels translated as if they were taking place roundabout today, I think in the South.
Do you mean the American South?
Oh, yes, the American South, I believe. And then there's also, and this is getting into our media part for Jesus, and particularly given the antisemitism that we talked about, I really find it deeply meaningful and really important to read the annotations from the Jewish annotated New Testament when I'm preparing a sermon or looking at a text, because there's a lot that I, as a Christian, will miss from what is happening and from the cultural context that comes up in the annotations or in the extra information and essays and stuff in that book. And both Kay and I love and appreciate that book.
Yeah.
And it was edited by our past guest and friend of the podcast, Amy Jill Levine, who also wrote Short Stories by Jesus, which digs into some of the parables that have been used in the most problematic anti-Semitic ways, but also some of the kind of iconic parables of Jesus. And so those are both fantastic reads. Short Stories by Jesus is not a super academic read. It is a very accessible read. The Jewish Annotated New Testament gets more academic just because it's a very serious study Bible, but it's not inaccessible. And my favorite two ways to learn and read about Jesus for kids are the Jesus Storybook Bible, which they make bilingually in English and Spanish, and the Spark Story Bible, which has a lot of stories about Jesus, and they frequently have a question to ask at the end to reflect on. So,
sure.
Yeah. Do you have any other tie-ins or media that you are thinking of, Kay, for biblical Jesus?
Well, I know that a lot of my colleagues have really been jumping up and down excited about the books of Robert Farrar Capon. He wrote 3 books on the parables of Jesus that have been put together into a collection and are super popular with a certain generation of pastor, and I think they still have a lot to offer, although I don't necessarily agree with every word he says, but it is a really interesting look at the parables and reminds us to keep our minds open and that there isn't just one way to think about any biblical passage. So that does a lovely job. I also know that Desmond Tutu did a children's story Bible that is really beautiful, and that would of course include the story of Jesus, but I don't think it's just the story of Jesus.
Cool. Who was the parables one? What was that one?
Kingdom, Grace, Judgment is the collection. Oh, have you not had every single pastor at all of your text studies quote Capon at you for the last 10 years? Because I have.
No, haven't ever heard of him, actually.
Okay. He was kind of the Amy Jill Levine before Amy Jill Levine, except that he's not Jewish. But in terms of trying to use the cultural context at the time to understand the parables better, he did a lot of really interesting work.
Nice.
So, our next supporting hero for today is Jesus, the historical Jesus. Looking at Jesus as a historical personage rather than through the Bible particularly. So, when we talk about historical knowledge of Jesus, there are basically two major things that we want to talk about. One is the historian Josephus, and the other is the Jesus Seminar. I'll get to those in just a second. But first, random trivia. We are actually pretty sure that, historically speaking, we did the math wrong, and Jesus' birth year was not actually the year 0 CE. I love telling confirmation students this because they are so angry about it. I'm not laughing at them, I'm laughing with them, I promise. But according to the Bible, Jesus was born either in a particular year of King Herod's reign or in the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Those are not the same year, no matter how hard people have tried to make them the same year. And so somewhere between the years of 6 and 4 BCE, before Common Era, or before Christ, was when Jesus was actually born. Somewhere along the line, someone did the math wrong. Christians are bad at math. We keep saying this for a reason, folks. But I love the fact that we got his birth year
Which
wrong.
is really sad because I love math, just for the record.
You can love things and be bad at them. That's fine. You're allowed.
I'm good at it.
Well, you didn't correct us about what Jesus' year of birth was, did you? So,
I mean, fair.
if you were really good at math, you would have traveled back in time by now and fixed that, Emily. Come on. So,
Yeah.
I can hear how Emily is looking at me through the camera right now, and that's amazing. Okay, so, jumping back to talking about the historical Jesus. The first historian we want to talk about is named Flavius Josephus, or just Josephus for short. That's sort of his classic name. And he was a historian who was born a few years after Jesus died, and rose again, and then ascended to heaven. But we're not talking about all of that because not all of that is historically attested, so we'll get to that in a minute. And Josephus was a Jewish man who eventually defected to Rome, and he wrote a few histories of Israel, which have survived in somewhat changed content to the present day.
Just to be clear, when we talk about him writing a few histories of Israel, we're talking about the historic Israel, not the nation-state that began in 1948.
Right, because this was 2,000 years ago, almost. So, yeah, that was a while back.
Yeah. There's enough confusion of the current Israel.
Yes, the modern country of Israel was not extant then, did not exist then.
Is not the same.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, as his works were recopied over the years, often by Christian monks, some Christians made some changes to the texts of his works in order to better align what he said with what Christians wanted history to say. And so, in his works, there are 2 references to Jesus and 1 reference to John the Baptist. Now, unfortunately, one of those Jesus references is pretty clearly added later on by Christians, because it is way more specific and detailed than it should be compared to the rest of the text. And so we're fairly sure that that was added later. The other reference to Jesus, however, is actually a brief mention of a man named James, who is then described as being the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, which is such a brief and in-passing kind of mention that it seems way more likely to be original to the text. So we're pretty sure that that part Josephus actually did write fairly soon after Jesus' death, at least a lot sooner than any of us are. And so that passage has been used as proof that Jesus existed as a historical person, because this is Jesus showing up outside of the Bible in Josephus's histories. And the reference to John the Baptist is also quite brief in Josephus's works, and is likely to be original to his work as well, although it does claim that Herod had John the Baptist executed due to what he was saying, and not according to that whole birthday party story that gets included in the Gospels, which some of us may have preached on recently.
Although, I will say, even in the Bible, John was arrested for what he was saying. Like, that's where he first got into trouble.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And then the Jesus Seminar was a group of mostly religion scholars, also scholars of a couple other disciplines, I think, that existed from the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s. The Jesus Seminar was very much made up mostly of white men, as you might imagine, from that time period. And they discussed and studied the Gospels and biblical history, but primarily the Gospels, with a goal of determining the historical accuracy of the Gospels as history. Now, before I really get into the Jesus Seminar, I would like to say, right off the bat, that one of the common experiences I had in both college as a religion major and then later in seminary is that any time anyone brought up the Jesus Seminar in a conversation, there tended to be a lot of yelling. People have strong opinions about the Jesus Seminar and their methods to this day. Now, I appreciate their efforts. I appreciate that they were asking the questions they were asking. I think those are good questions. I am absolutely not taking any kind of stand on their methods or scholarship. I do not have an opinion. I am Switzerland. If you are going to write us angry emails, they should be about something other than the Jesus Seminar. I'm just here to tell you the basics, okay? Love you all. Thank you. So, with that in mind, when the Jesus Seminar got together and evaluated the contents of the Gospels for historical accuracy, they said that each passage, each part of the Gospel, was more likely to be accurate if it was one or more of the following things. If it was short and memorable enough to survive being passed down orally for decades before it was written down, which makes sense. If it had some element of irony, twist, or surprise to it that aligned with Jesus' tendency to be, frankly, a bit of a smart aleck and be all about turning the expected upside down. Again, makes sense. And third, if it encouraged people to put their trust in God rather than in earthly things or in other people, because this is another common theme for Jesus. Again, we see that a lot in the Gospels. They also said that a passage was less likely to be historically accurate if it was one of the following things. If it included Jesus talking about himself, which he did not actually tend to do that often. That doesn't show up that much in the Gospels. That's kind of why they were suspicious of that. A passage might not be historically accurate if it is essentially framing another story or a parable. That material might have been added as a storytelling method, basically. Or if it is about issues that early Christians were facing in the decades after Jesus' death, and therefore might have been added by the Gospel authors directed toward those early Christians who were their audience. So that's less likely to be historically accurate to Jesus' time rather than to the time of the Gospel authors. And so as they had these conversations over the course of a couple decades, over time they deduced that it was very likely that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure who really did live in that time and place, approximately, that his mother was almost certainly named Mary. He traveled the area and he taught, he ate with outcasts, and he practiced faith healings, at least ones of disorders that were probably largely psychosomatic. That probably did happen. And he was almost definitely executed by crucifixion by the Roman Empire for essentially being a public nuisance. Not so much the whole religious Son of God blasphemy thing, but rather he was making trouble for the empire. They could not vouch for the historical accuracy of his various miracles or of the resurrection, because those don't show up in other sources. Now, there was, and continues to be, quite a bit of backlash to the Jesus Seminar, also known as, see my earlier disclaimer about this. People got real angry, and since the concept of discussing the Gospels as historical documents has split more than one Christian denomination, that's not really a big surprise. Just ask the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, or don't, because they'll just start yelling at you instead. So...
Oh, that was good. That was good.
I'm just here to be helpful.
Shout out to Seminex.
Yeah, and all of our delightful AELC pastors who joined us from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We are eternally grateful to the Missouri Synod for them. They're awesome. So, as for publications and media about the historical Jesus, well, actually, the Jesus Seminar put out quite a few publications. Wikipedia has a whole list of them on the Jesus Seminar Wikipedia article site, which can get you some of the basics. We can also link to one of my favorite things that the Jesus Seminar did is that they produced their own translation of the Gospels. That was like their very first job. When they wrote that, they used modern casual language rather than doing an exact technical translation like the NRSV to get the ideas across. So in the Luke Beatitudes, for example, there are verses that start in the NRSV with woe to you, and in the Jesus Seminar translation it starts with damn you. That's not a swear word, Apple. I'm just quoting the Bible there. So They did that in order to get the ideas across better. And so you can buy a revised copy of that translation from Bookshop for about $20. And we will link to that and have that up in our Season 5 book list as well. And so what do you love about the historical Jesus? Emily?
I love the things that we know about Jesus. I feel like I'm going to steal yours because I already saw that you wrote it down. But I do love that, like, how do we know that Jesus probably said that? Is it a smart aleck thing? Yes, then he probably said it, right? But, like, that Jesus was... And Amy Jo Levine talks about this too, right? Jesus is pushing us. Jesus is telling parables and having conversations that are intended to make people think and intended to make people question. And so pushing against the assumptions. I love that aspect of Jesus, historical Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely had written down, and we'll stop doing that because that leads to Emily stealing my things. But
it's true anyway. I just was like, oh no.
I also love that Jesus being a smart aleck is such a defining characteristic of him that it helps us determine the historical accuracy of whether he said something. That is fabulous. I am so glad to be Christian in part because of that. I cannot tell you how deeply satisfying it is to my soul to follow a smart aleck. That's amazing. And makes my life so much more worthwhile. And then for our tie-in to today's theme, I only picked one Bible passage because I wasn't really here to talk about all of the Gospels today. That was Emily's job. And so while John is not actually my favorite of the Gospels by any means, the Bible passage I actually picked for the historical Jesus is John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Which is the story of Jesus being forgiving to the supposedly adulterous woman. There's a whole bunch of, stuff we could get into about that story. I'm not really here to do that today. My point about this story is that this passage is not found in several of the earliest copies of the Gospel of John that we have access to. And so, because of that, we don't know that it is original to the Gospel of John. It may have been added later. And so, actually, if you open a Bible, sometimes you won't find these verses in the Gospel of John. You'll find that chapter 8 starts with verse 12, and they'll usually have a little footnote there about it. But a lot of Bibles do include this passage anyway, and they'll also include a footnote saying that we don't know how accurate this is to the original Gospel of John. But I love the fact that the reason why we include it, the reason why it keeps getting put into the Bible is because it is just such a Jesus-y story. It is a passage that sounds like the Jesus we know and love so much that people keep putting it in there, even though we know perfectly well that it might not be original to the gospel. And part of the reason why I love this is because the Lutheran Church has a very similar story about something that Martin Luther almost certainly did not say. We have no proof of Martin Luther saying this, but there is an old yarn about Martin Luther saying that a good Christian shoemaker puts their faith into their work, not by putting little crosses on the shoes that they make, but by making good quality shoes, because that's what their neighbor needs. We have no proof that Martin Luther said that, but it sounds like him, and so we keep telling that story because it is so Luthery a story. And so I love the fact that we have these stories that sound so right. Not just so good, but so right, so correct to the person that we keep telling them, even though they probably didn't say that. And I like to think that when we get to heaven and we have conversations with Jesus and Martin Luther, they will both love each of their stories that we think are so much them, even if they aren't real.
Yeah, I like it. So, that brings us to pop culture Jesus. And we are talking about a particular type of pop culture Jesus. Jesus has been part of cultures for literally millennia. And we have depictions of Jesus throughout the millennia, all of that stuff. But there's a particular way that pop culture Jesus has come about. So our joking birth of pop culture Jesus is the 1950s in the United States. His death is TBD, to be determined. Here's hoping pop culture Jesus gets laid to rest sooner rather than later, because it's not helping Jesus, the Jesus movement, Christianity, the world,
the way,
any of that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So The thing about pop culture Jesus is that pop culture Jesus is not in any way, shape, or form accurate to biblical Jesus or historical Jesus. Pop culture Jesus is the Jesus that gets invoked by people who want Jesus to be on their side because they want you to agree with them, often so that you'll give them money or your vote or various other useful things.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about pop culture Jesus, my first reference that I would encourage you to look at is a book called Jesus and John Wayne. Yes, it's that John Wayne. It's the actor. It's by Dr. Kristen Dumais, and she did a lovely job of tracing the American Christian Church back to just before John Wayne's career started and how their image of Christianity looked then and then how it changed after the American culture moved away from loyalty to America and moved into loyalty to corporations, loyalty to concepts, loyalty to things like manliness and stuff like that, instead of loyalty to each other, to people.
Capitalism.
Yeah. So when we talk about pop culture Jesus, we're talking about churches that raffle off guns. We're talking about people who invoke Jesus to be a rule enforcer or to be someone who causes punishment against the people they disagree with. We're talking about a Jesus who is always masculine and never feminine.
Who drape the cross in a U.S. flag.
Yeah, and usually voting for a particular political party, actually. And so pop culture Jesus is an entirely different creation than actual Jesus, whether you're talking about actual biblical Jesus or actual historical Jesus.
Yep. And along those lines, this particular kind of pop culture Jesus is known for Christian nationalism, Christian supremacy, white Christian nationalism, and white Christian supremacy, very much like used by people to oppress other people.
Yes.
Which is decidedly not how Jesus shows up in the Bible. And the couple times where it could be interpreted that way, then he changes his mind and is like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe love is bigger than that.
Don't set people on fire. Jesus was very big on not setting people on fire.
Yeah. This Jesus is also white, which is not accurate historically or biblically.
Yeah.
Though I do get a real distinct pleasure from the times when people have pictures of Ewan McGregor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and think that it's like a picture of Jesus. I'm like,
yeah, no.
That's from Star Wars, but okay. Yeah, sure. Totally.
I mean, we did cast Samuel L. Jackson as Mace Windu as Moses, so, you know, it's not like we're entirely innocent of this ourselves, but...
Yes, but we did that knowing that he was actually Mace Windu.
Yes.
And not
That's
Moses.
Right. And if Moses could have had a purple lightsaber, he totally would have. But, moving on.
Probably, yeah. So, this pop culture Jesus comes out in really harmful ways. One of the ways, if you look at the slaughter of the Emmanuel 9, whose feast day was in June, this past June, and every June, Dylan Roof, who went to Bible study at that black church with black people and then slaughtered them, very much has a white Jesus in his own personal theology, in his journals and artwork. All of that stuff depicts a very white Jesus. So when we say Jesus is not white, we mean Jesus cannot be white.
Yeah.
In that sense, because it is so steeped in white supremacy. And it is violent and harmful. And even when it is not physically violent, it is still violent towards people. And that's not the way of Jesus. Also, and we will talk about it more later, but The Passion of the Christ is a movie that Mel Gibson did that is really problematic. It is very much anti-Semitic. It is very harmful. If you want a full deep dive into The Passion of the Christ, check out the episode that Pace and I did for Horror Nerds at Church on it last year. The Passion of the Christ is not a great movie for understanding who Jesus was, or the crucifixion, or the Passion, Holy Week, that sort of thing. It is a movie that depicts Jesus in particular ways that reinforce and strengthen anti-Semitism and very harmful tropes. It is like, it really is a horror movie.
Yeah.
And also biblical-ish. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, sometimes pop culture Jesus shows up in ways that are more ridiculous than actively harmful, and these are some of my favorites. Because, someone out there has Precious Moments Jesus figurines, and I just bless your heart, I think, in the words of the American South, and and that sort of thing. And one of my favorite types of pop culture Jesus that shows up in the ridiculous is that we need to explain to people that Jesus does not and never did play American football. And that's whether we're talking about touchdown Jesus, who is at one end of the football field at, I think it's Brigham Young University in Utah, who is a very tall statue and has his arms up basically like a field goal. Or, if we're talking about the song, Drop Kick Me Jesus Through the Goalposts of Life, which is a classic piece of Americana that I cannot begin to describe to you, but we will link you to it on YouTube because everyone needs to experience this at least once, just so that I'm not the only one. Thank you very much. But also just because it is an extraordinary way of talking about Jesus. And I'm not angry about it. I'm not mad about it, but it's a lot. I don't really have words. So, yeah, Jesus did not actually play football, but, if you want Jesus to drop kick you through the goalposts of life, maybe you need to have a conversation with a therapist. I'm just saying. And on the other hand, it is a fun song. And also, we try to translate Jesus into the modern world, and we've done that in a number of different ways. One movie that is not super well known, but I was forced to watch in a religion class in college, is called Jesus of Montreal.
Wow, forced. Okay.
Well, it was part of a class. It's not like this was a thing I chose to do in my free time, let's put it that way.
Gotcha. It
is an interesting movie where they tried to imagine what if Jesus showed up in Montreal in, I think, the 90s, and how would the story translate into the modern day? I had a few issues with it. Jesus, if I'm remembering right, I think was an art student who shows up in Montreal and is genuinely very welcoming and open to the marginalized and very friendly and kind to people and generous and so forth. All of that was pretty well handled. He was definitely white, but with brown hair, if I remember right. And also, instead of the traditional resurrection story, after his death, he lives on by donating multiple organs to multiple people and creating new life in that way. Which was a really interesting choice. I don't exactly know that I could say I recommend the movie, but it is interesting food for thought. I will say that. I don't know that I would watch it because I want to watch a good movie, but if you want to think about Jesus in new ways, it can do that for you. Absolutely.
Nice. Also, there's a depiction of Jesus in the movie Saved that I really love. First off, Saved is just a fantastic movie. It is
absolutely
satire, and it very much depicts the exaggerated type of Jesus, pop culture Jesus, that we are talking about right now. That is very prosperity gospel, that is very exclusive, all of that stuff. But they also have a, buddy Jesus in the movie that reminds me of also bobblehead Jesus, right? This Jesus that is just there to say yes to whatever you want. And that is also not Jesus. That's also not how Jesus works, but is very much a pop culture kind of Jesus. And Pace and I actually recorded a live podcast episode on the movie Saved for the Q Christian Conference a couple years ago. So we can link to that as well if you want to dig deeper into the movie Saved. But sure. Kay and I have both watched it, and it's a fantastic, hilarious movie.
Absolutely.
It's got Mandy Moore and a bunch of other people, but yeah.
I would also throw out there that while the movie Dogma is not primarily about Jesus, Chris Rock spends a decent amount of his time on screen talking about Jesus and how he still owes him money. And and that conversation about Jesus is also pretty interesting. So
yeah. And now, we've got for you 2 favorites that we're going to talk about. Some of them, these are not necessarily our favorites, but the questions, which we invite you, our dear listeners, yes, you, I know you think that we're talking about other people, but we're not. We're actually talking about you in particular in this moment, not other people, you. Do you have a favorite or a couple favorite Christian, as in somehow tells the nativity story, Christmas movies? A couple Christmas movies that are out there that would be, options to choose from are The Nativity Story, which has a primarily non-white, from what I remember / could tell, cast that depicts the story of the Nativity, mostly according to Luke and Matthew. So kind of an amalgamation of their accounts.
Sure.
I watched it when it first came out, I think, and I thought it was pretty good as far as, biblical movies go. It's no Prince of Egypt, but not bad.
One of my favorite Christmas movies that tells the story of Jesus' birth is actually the Charlie Brown Christmas special, which is getting a little older now, but it's the story of a few children having Christmas together, and at one point, one of them does tell the story of Jesus' birth, and it is a treasured piece of my childhood.
Yeah. Same. I was actually thinking about it when I was writing out some of the options. I was like, really, we should just put this as the podcast's favorite, because I had a feeling that it would be both of our favorites. But both Kay and I really like the Charlie Brown Christmas. There's so much of... I love Christmas. Anybody who has listened to the podcast during December and January and November and other times knows that. But so much of Christmas movies are not actually based on the nativity or Christian values or what the nativity is about. There's a lot of it's about family, and
no, it's not.
It's actually not. It's not at all. So I really like the way that the Charlie Brown Christmas special both includes the values of Christmas kind of stuff, but ultimately also rests and centers in the Christmas story.
Yeah.
The nativity.
Back in the day, TLC, the Learning Channel, used to do a TV show that was all birth videos. And one day, some bright soul is going to do one of those in a barn. And that is going to be the closest thing to a historically accurate nativity story that we have. And everyone's going to freak out. But we don't have that yet, as far as I know. And if you do know about a movie like that, please, for the love of God, don't tell me. I don't want to know about it.
I don't know about movies, but I know there's artwork that depicts
I'm sure.
Jesus' birth and includes the afterbirth and those sorts of things that were real and happened, and probably there were midwives there. We just don't talk about them. Yeah. Also, there's some others, like Small Camel is a cute one. It has some anti-Semitic depictions in it. It's a very old Disney cartoon 26-minute thing that just has the tie-in at the very, very end. But The Star is one that I haven't actually seen because it hasn't been on the streaming services that I have access to at any of the right times, so I have not gotten to the point where I'm willing to pay extra to see it. But The Star looks like an adorable movie. It is basically the combo Luke-Matthew nativity story from the perspective of all the animals.
Aww.
And it just looks fun and
excellent,
funny and delightful. So I can't technically recommend it, but definitely at least honorable mention. And if anybody wants to send it to us, please do.
And this is not a movie, but there is a song called The Rebel Jesus by Jackson Browne, and we can link you to a copy of it on YouTube. And it's a Christmas song that is about Jesus the way that we forget that he was sometimes. It's sort of a Christmas song about the not pop culture Jesus. And I grew up with this song, and I very much appreciate it. So we can link you to that.
Indeed, indeed.
And then we have some of our favorite non-birth Jesus-y movies and or TV shows in one case. And, of course, many people love the movie Jesus Christ Superstar, and there are at least two versions of the movie itself, the version from the 70s and the version from the 90s. If you're going to pick between those two, I would say go with the 70s version, because the 90s version includes some people that look like they should be stormtroopers from Star Wars, and it just throws me out of the movie so badly I can't even begin to tell you. I have also heard lovely things about the live concert version that John Legend did a few years ago. I have not actually gotten around to watching that yet, mostly because I'm usually rewatching the 70s version of the movie. Look, I just have some favorites, okay? And so
That's fair.
I really appreciate Jesus Christ Superstar, and I especially appreciate that Mary Magdalene in that movie, in the 70s version, is not white. Thank God. And that was a lovely choice. And we, in fact, did a episode where we talked about Jesus Christ Superstar, the 1970s version, and we can link you to that too.
Yep. Yeah, we will link to that in our episode description. Another movie which is on our not favorite list, as in our least favorite non-birth Jesus-y movie, is Passion of the Christ. As I mentioned, it is anti-Semitic, it is body horror to the extreme, it is not biblical, it is just is bad theology, bad everything. It is part of, and Pace and I talked about this in the episode, but it is both part of and reinforcing some of the problematic turns that both media and Christianity were taking in that time period that led us down the path to our former president who's now trying to be president again.
Yeah.
So the other movie that I, again, have not seen because it hasn't been on any of the streaming services I have access to is The Last Temptation of Christ, which I have heard wonderful things about it. I really want to see it at some point. I think it would be really interesting. It's based on the book of the same name, but really it's a much queerer reading of Jesus, and I really love that.
And from what I've heard, everyone I know who has seen the movie has said that while Willem Dafoe is definitely white and Jesus should not be white, he actually does a really good acting job in that movie. Like, no one argues with his acting cred in that movie at all.
Nice.
Yeah. And then also, while this isn't a movie, The Chosen, the TV show that is available on its own website as well as a couple other streaming services. I have seen most of the first season. It is a attempt at portraying with some historical accuracy to the culture and time period and what things actually would look like back then. Jesus's life according to the scripture, except, of course, that they have to, smudge all of the gospels together, kind of, in order to make it work. And aside from some of the lighting choices, which we talked about in our episode on lighting a few months ago, they do a good job of trying to balance all of that. And they do a great job of portraying just how dark it gets when you don't have electricity and you only have a couple oil lamps. But part of the issue with that is that you can't see anything for like half of the scenes. So keep that in mind and turn your volume up. But it is an interesting portrayal, and I appreciate their effort.
So, we've been asking this in each of our categories, and this one is a little bit weird, but what do you love about pop culture Jesus?
So I should say that again, because I do this, I wrote down what my answer was, and earlier Emily looked at my answer and said, "You can't say that. We're not saying what we love about the movies. We're saying what we love about pop culture Jesus." And I said, "No, this is what I love about pop culture Jesus. So just hang on with me for a second and we'll get there." But my favorite part about pop culture Jesus is Linus and his blankie from the Charlie Brown Christmas special. Because Linus, in the Charlie Brown comic strip in Peanuts, is famous for loving his security blanket, taking it with him wherever he goes. It is always on him in some sense. When he dresses up for the Christmas play, it is the hood that he wears over his head so that it's always with him. He never goes anywhere without his blanket, not even to wait for the Great Pumpkin in the Halloween special. But the one time that you see Linus in any of the specials, or as far as I know, any time in any of the comic strips, not touching his blanket is during the Christmas special, because he drops it while he tells the story of the birth of Jesus, because that's the only time he feels safe without his blanket. What I love about pop culture Jesus is that no matter how irritating and wrong and horrible it can get, sometimes the actual gospel can come through. So Linus and his blankie is my favorite part that I love about pop culture Jesus.
I love it. I love that. I struggled with this for a minute, and then I was like, no, I know what I'm going to put, because this is an important part of pop culture Jesus and how we are witnessing a shift in pop culture Jesus. Pop culture Jesus that we've talked about so far has been very much rooted in white supremacist, cis hetero patriarchy, capitalist, bad stuff.
Yeah, imperial stuff.
Yeah. And that's harmful. But what has also been happening increasingly over the last several decades, almost a century, maybe, definitely the last several decades, is that we have started to see and have lifted up different depictions of Jesus that are not just the white supremacist Jesus. So, yes, there's the Black Madonna in Poland that has always been there, but there's also this sense of from particular communities. So we get, a trans Jesus. We have, Kay and I were talking about, friend of the podcast, Pace Warfield's depiction of a Jesus in the Transfiguration a transfiguration Jesus. There's a very famous painting of top surgery Jesus from a resurrection account.
Yeah.
There's black Jesus. A lot of liberation theologies have come out with particular Jesuses that then have also been depicted in art and those sorts of things. And I love that diversity because that actually circles us back to a fuller picture of Jesus and a more accurate in spirit depiction of Jesus.
Yeah.
Which I love.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to tie into today's theme, we do have a Bible passage for pop culture Jesus, which is Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 12, or the Matthew Beatitudes. And we wanted to mention this Bible passage for pop culture Jesus because whenever you hear someone in power quoting Jesus for their own ends, mysteriously, this passage, the Beatitudes, will almost always be contradicted by however they happen to be describing or characterizing Jesus at that point. Instead, they usually portray Jesus as being very into enforcing rules and bigotry and power. And so whenever you hear someone quoting Jesus for their own ends, ask yourself, does this line up with the Beatitudes? And that can give you a little bit of a reality check.
Yeah. I also love the Beatitudes because for those of us who preach on the Revised Common Lectionary, as many of you who are our listeners to our first 3 seasons, when the former president was elected, the weekend of the inauguration, the Beatitudes were the assigned reading. And I think it's hilarious because every bishop that I've had a conversation about this with said that the time that they had the most phone calls from angry parishioners about worship or about their pastor was that weekend because the Beatitudes were the readings. And so they were like, why is it getting all political? This is about the actual scripture, not even about the sermon, but about the scripture that was read. And I love that. It's just so on point.
Because sometimes the lectionary is used by the Holy Spirit for the Holy Spirit's own ends.
Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes the things that are written about Jesus in the Gospels are consistent or semi-consistent with Jesus. Yeah. So, delightfulness. And then we have some media. So, this is some of our fun and favorite pop culture Jesus things. My favorite book, which I need to do a reread of it soon because I haven't in several years, but is Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal by Christopher Moore. It's hilarious, especially if you don't mind raunchiness, and the more biblical knowledge you have, the better, because there's all these little references thrown in, but I also don't think you need that to enjoy the book.
Yeah.
And then The Cross and the Lynching Tree is pop culture in the way that I was talking about what I love about newer pop culture Jesus. But James Cone, who's the author, wrote this, and I read it in seminary. It's really accessible. You don't have to have a master's degree to understand it. But it ties together an understanding of Jesus' crucifixion with an understanding of contemporary and historical U.S. lynching and tying those experiences together so that they inform one another in really helpful ways. And the third book, which I haven't read since I was in high school or college maybe, but stuck with me in a really profound way. And for me, it reminded me of Jesus of Montreal that you were talking about, Kay.
Okay.
But Eli by Bill Myers, because it is in many ways a retelling of the Jesus story in contemporary times from when it was written, of a guy who gets in an accident and is in a coma, and in the coma encounters Jesus as one of Jesus' disciples, but modern day. So
interesting.
There's definitely the decision salvation stuff in there, but I liked the way it tied into and pointed towards what would it be like, right? It asks the question, what would it be like if Jesus actually came today?
Right. Also, of course, we already mentioned Jesus of Montreal and Saved and Passion of the Christ as a not recommended option and so forth. But I also wanted to bring up the Lego Bible because people keep trying to figure out new ways to tell the stories in the Bible, and the Lego Bible is one of them. I do want to emphasize that despite the fact that the Lego Bible uses a lot of Legos, this is not a publication for children. This is a publication for adults. It includes a fair amount of sex and violence, and while the sex and violence are not super, gory or lewd because they're made with Legos, it's still more than you want an 8-year-old to look at. And there are words in there that you probably don't want your 8-year-old to learn, but they are remarkably accurate to the actual Bible texts. So I'll tell you that much. But it's basically the Bible illustrated by Lego creations. And it's very creative, and they did a super interesting job with it. There's a book for what they call the Old Testament and for the New Testament as well, a separate volume.
Nice. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah. And then we come to our other themes that tie in with all of the people. And
Jesus?
it's a weirder one for Jesus. But I do think that one of the things that ties in with Jesus that we see also when we look at any sort of superhero is this sense that the stories don't always line up. And we get this in the comics a lot, right? Like alternate universe stories and the paths and the origin story of Ms. Marvel is different in the comics than it is in the show, that sort of a thing. But we also get this like deification of superheroes, right? We make them into gods who can do no wrong, who are infallible, and that doesn't serve us. And it loses the historical who that person is. And I think that happens extra with Jesus because, Christianity, there's like an entire religion built around him. Mm-hmm. But also, I think holding to historical context helps me understand Jesus better, the Bible better, my faith better. And I think when we look at the historical context of all of our heroes, that also helps. Understanding more of the historical context of Martin Luther King Jr., of Malcolm X, of Wilma Mankiller helps us understand how they're making those connections, how what they do and say matters in new, different, more profound ways, which is cool.
Yeah. I also think that one of the themes that just kept coming around is Jesus reaching out to people who are marginalized. It kept coming up in all of the Jesuses, and that is such a defining characteristic for Jesus that we cannot ignore it no matter how hard we try.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now for our Muppets moment. Now, mostly for this season, our question has been, which Muppet would you cast for which of our heroes today? But today, we're talking about Jesus. And Jesus.
And Jesus.
And Jesus.
And Jesus.
And so instead, we're going to twist that question just a little bit and ask, which Muppet would you cast for which of the Gospels version of Jesus? Which Muppet would you cast for Matthew's Jesus, for Mark's, for Luke's, for John's? And so, Emily, do you have any ideas that you would like to share with us?
Yes. I'm also really excited about this because we went to somewhat great pains to not really cast Jesus. Sometimes our guests did, and that's fine. But Kay and I didn't really cast Jesus for our Muppets moments for Let's Make a Muppets musical in our Revised Common Lectionary seasons. And so I'm excited that we get a chance.
I think we might have cast Jesus as a token human once or twice, but not as a Muppet.
Maybe.
The reason why we really tried not to cast Jesus as a Muppet, and really we didn't cast Jesus very often as a human, is because we wanted to make it clear that the Muppets moment is not about disrespecting the Bible or being flip about the Bible. We are doing this because it helps us understand the Bible. And we knew that if we started talking about Jesus as a Muppet, we could wind up going viral in a bad way, and that was not our goal. But we've been doing this for a while now, and you guys seem to be connecting with it, and so we think that you get why we're doing this and how it does help us understand the Bible and how it does help us understand Jesus. And so we thought that by this point, the idea has probably matured enough that we can do this.
Yeah. Also, that was not my understanding of why we were not casting Jesus. I thought we were just not casting Jesus because it would be too easy to default to just casting Jesus. Because Jesus
that's probably also
is
fair.
An option for everything. But yeah, so I'm excited to cast Jesus. My first casting, we're not each going to do all 4 Gospels, but we're going to try and cast somebody for each of the Gospels. My first pick is for the Gospel of John, because Jesus is so divine and ethereal. I just think that Sweetums would be such a good Jesus in John.
Absolutely.
So that's my first pick. What about you, Kay?
Sure. Well, okay, so I have a pick, but the thing is, I could cast this person for one of two of the Gospels, for each for a different reason.
Ooh.
So I want you to help me decide if they have to be one or the other, or can they be both. Because, okay, so we have the Muppet of Rohloff, right? The piano player, Rohloff, who is a dog Muppet. Yeah. And the thing is on the one hand, he is the musician of the Muppet, like one of the musicians, but also like the musician of the main Muppets, the central cast. And if there is a gospel where I genuinely believe that the whole group at any time could just break out into song, it is Luke, right?
I knew it. I knew you were going to say Luke. I was thinking Luke. Okay.
Because they are such real people, they are so fully fleshed out. Yeah, those guys could break into song anytime. Mm-hmm. Matthew and Mark really know, right? You don't imagine them breaking out into song. If John tried to break out into song, it would turn into some sort of like choral aria or opera or something, and that's not really Rolf's speed. And so I'm sure he could do it, like he has the talent, but that's not where he'd go.
But Luke even has gospel canticles.
Yes, exactly.
Has 3 gospel canticles. We've already put them to music multiple times. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm here for it.
On the one hand, Rolf could be Jesus in Luke. On the other hand, Rolf is also the one Muppet of the central cast who is universally agreed to be super not white. Like, we have all agreed with many, many guests that Rolf is black, right? Even though none of the Muppets really have a skin color. And the thing is that if there is a gospel that makes it clear to us again and again and again that Jesus was not a white American person, it is Matthew, because Matthew is set so very firmly in ancient Israel and is so very firmly attached to ancient Israel's history and traditions and idioms and so forth. And so if you have a gospel that reminds you that Jesus is absolutely not white, it's Matthew.
Interesting.
So I'm torn. Is Rolf both of them, or just one, or what?
I think that Luke also does that fairly well because of the ways that Jesus resists affiliation with empire. So I'm inclined to say that I think Rolf, based on what you have said, would fit really well with Luke on both accounts, whereas only with Matthew on one of them.
That's interesting.
What do you think?
The thing is that I've been preaching the Revised Common Lectionary for several years now, and I find myself spending a lot less time when I'm preaching Luke explaining the backstory or explaining the culture. Whereas the year that we do Matthew, I feel like I have to reserve at least a third of the sermon for explaining how all this stuff works before I can explain what the story's actually saying.
I thought that was always explaining the parts that we make into anti-Semitic parts.
Well, that part too
is what I thought was happening in Matthew all the time.
There's a decent chunk for that too.
Yeah. That's my association with Matthew, is we have to be really careful and intentional about addressing.
We also have to do that.
The ways it has been used to harm.
Sure.
I get that. I would vote for Luke for Rolf,
okay.
I think.
That works. Would you like to pick another one?
Yeah. So, okay. This is tricky. The way you were talking about Matthew also kind of reminded me of Kermit. I don't know if it's Kermit, but Matthew feels like the one with all of the explanation to it and digging into all of that stuff. And that feels maybe more like a Kermit thing. I don't know.
Kermit does tell all the backstory. He is the character we start with and the character we end with usually. Absolutely. I could see that. I think in this case, your casting of Kermit is less about his personality than we often do with Kermit. But I can see how he plays that role in the Muppets. Yeah, absolutely. And then for Mark, I do have a casting, because Mark, I often like to tell people that Mark is known as the truck driver's gospel because everybody is constantly on the move in Mark. And so when I think of who is constantly on the move, you know who's always walking is Big Bird. Big Bird is always walking around with his friends. And so I think Big Bird works for Jesus in Mark.
Interesting. While I was talking about the Kermit and Matthew, came up with another one for Mark, so I'm also going to throw it out there. I like the Big Bird, like always moving, always walking and talking. I also think Gonzo.
Okay. Because
there's an urgency, and Gonzo, when Gonzo goes to Gonzo the Great, but there's an urgency. It's still like a moving and telling, but it's a faster paced, I think, than Big Bird is. But it's also, Gonzo is like, let's go. We're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and we're climbing up the window to get into Scrooge's house, and all of that stuff. So, I think I'll add Gonzo in.
Absolutely.
But I also like Big Bird. Okay. This is exciting. Oh, I can't wait.
Now I'm imagining an episode of Sesame Street where Gonzo guest stars, and I just love that thought. It would be so much fun.
Right? Yeah. This is fun. I was a little bit anxious about how this would go, because how do you do an episode on Jesus, Jesus, and Jesus? But this is apparently how.
Jesus provides.
Woo-hoo.
Absolutely.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for joining us, dear listeners, dear nerdlings. I keep wanting to bring that in, but nobody tells me if they think it's a good idea or not, except for Kay. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, our Muppets music was by Brenda Boss, and our seasonal artwork was by Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into Spider-Man. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it's cheaper than traveling around Israel on foot for 3 years with all your friends and then getting murdered.
Ding, 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 ding. Womp, womp. Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter who you would cast for which Jesus, whether you do it by the Gospels or historical pop culture biblical Jesuses.
Absolutely. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.